what I found was that both in 1956, during the Hungarian uprising, and then again following the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Czechoslovakia, there are small but active and very vocal groups of Ukrainians in the Western borderlands in particular who believe that the unrest in Eastern Europe will spread to Ukraine and will provide a spark for the outbreak of a major war that will lead to Ukrainian independence. Some people express these views in private conversations that are intercepted by the KGB. Some people go further and even begin to dig trenches in the woods in preparation for a seemingly impending war. The Soviet state is ruthless in dealing with these kinds of views. Arrests, repressions, invigilation are the norm. The very fact that we know so much about these people results from the fact that the KGB is monitoring what they are doing. The KGB is listening in on their phone conversations. They are following them and reporting on their every move. In other words, these people who tend to be, at least according to the KGB, former members of the OUN, they have very little room to maneuver, which explains also, of course, why they are such a small group ultimately. The Soviet state, I think, is effective in eliminating these views, not only from public discourse, but also from more unofficial context, because people are simply afraid to say these sorts of things. I think what's more interesting, perhaps, is a history of what I call in the book reformist patriotism, Soviet reformist patriotism. This is a set of views expressed mostly by young people and mostly by well-educated people who, inspired by what they see in Eastern Europe, for instance, inspired by the relaxation of censorship in Poland or the introduction of certain elements of the market economy in Hungary, they begin to call for similar changes in the USSR itself. These people do not see themselves, they do not portray themselves as being anti-Soviet. They never question the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union, and yet they pose quite a challenge to the Soviet authorities. Often this challenge is framed in Ukrainian terms. So these reformist Soviet patriots, as I call them, they begin to complain about the Russification of Ukraine. They begin to complain very vocally about the fact that more opportunities are given to the Greek Catholic Church in Czechoslovakia at a time when the Greek Catholic Church is still outlawed in the USSR itself. So they begin to voice very far-reaching criticism of Soviet policy, and including Soviet policy towards Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian institutions, and yet they present themselves as loyal citizens because they say, look, the people doing these things are your allies. These are fellow socialist countries that are pursuing these policies, so how could we possibly be anti-Soviet or anti-socialist in trying to copy these socialist countries across the border? And in 1956, these kinds of views are actually quite widespread, and the authorities tolerate some of them, and they can even be expressed in very public contexts, such as agitation meetings. By 1968, following the Prague Spring, which really convinces the Soviet authorities that attempts to reform Soviet-style regimes are dangerous and lead to instability, by 1968, these kinds of views, this kind of Soviet reformist patriotism is confined to the sphere of dissent. And it's illegal, and people expressing similar views are facing a whole range of repressions in the late 1960s, in the 1970s, and in the 1980s. So I think here we see a more complex story, because we see a larger group of people who define themselves both as loyal patriots of the Soviet Union and as critics of Soviet policy, who are at first, in the first few years after Stalin's death, tolerated by the Soviet authorities, and who increasingly come under attack after 1968.